Hi guys, welcome to the Hefni Guitar channel. Recently I did a video on the evolution of the post-CBS modern Stratocasters. Had a lot of fun doing that, and now I want to do a little bit on the evolution of the vintage Stratocasters. So in my research I came across some information that really blew my mind, and I just wanted to share it with my channel. So the story goes, the vintage Stratocasters originated in the tail end of the CBS era. This was before Fender became FMIC. By the early 80s, circa 1981, 1982, Fender had already come up with a few contemporary Stratocasters in this era, which were the Gold Stratocaster, the Walnut Stratocaster, and interestingly, the Two-Knot Stratocaster, where they took out the jack plate, the traditional jack plate, and replaced the second toe knob with a jack input, which is very strange. And they also had the Elite Stratocasters, which is not to be confused with the Fender American Elite Stratocasters from the late 2010s. It should be noted that these Stratocasters were considered contemporary or modern at the time. However, the specifications weren't exactly accurate. There were differences in the headstock shape. It's minor differences, but still differences nonetheless. In the pickup design, the pickguard, even the bridge. So you can say that these designs by the 1980s, early 80s had deviated from the original Stratocaster designs of the 1950s and 60s. Similarly, some other guitar instrument making companies, for instance like Ludwig Drums, the drum set that they made from the 1980s had already gone out of production, and a lot of the employees had left. So when they wanted to reissue these instruments, they had to go back and do their own research based on the company records and blueprints. So similarly, Fender had to do their research. Legend has it that they discovered a guitar store that had over 200 instruments from the era. So Fender sent down their people and they took measurements, took notes, took photos. And at the end of the day, they took home 3 guitars which served as the templates for the 57 and 62 reissue guitars. This is the line that eventually became the Fender American Vintage, but this was still over a decade away. So in 1982, Fender released the 57 reissue as well as the 62 reissue Stratocaster. It was marketed as the Fender US Vintage series, not the American Vintage as yet. These were very good reproductions at the time, but they were still not vintage accurate. Similarly, as I said, there were certain parts about the headstock and the pickguard and things like that were not purely 100% vintage accurate. If you look at the custom shop listings for the options, you come across this thing called the 12-fret dot spacing. And then it offers the option of having it closer or narrower, right? And this is actually originated from the research done on the US vintage or the 57 and 62 vintage reissue Stratocasters. They found out at the time that the 57 and 62 reissues, the dot distance between the 12-fret markers were not exactly accurate. However, those on the Fender Japan Stratocasters were accurate. So today at the custom shop level, if you wanted that accuracy up to that level, right, you can have it as closely as you want if you're into that sort of thing, but just know that this actually originated from the research done on the vintage reissue series. So nonetheless, the specs for the 57 reissue as well as the 62 reissue, which served as the template for the American Vintage series that were to come later, has already been pretty much solidified going into the post-CBS era. This range is sort of like the flagship range of the Fender USA offerings, aside from the Signature series as well as the upper echelon like the Strat Pluses and the Deluxes. My first experience with a Fender USA Vintage 57 Stratocaster was at a gig in high school where we were playing the song I'll Be There For You, and I was using my friend's dad's 57 reissue in black. And what I recall from that experience, it was the first time I played a professional instrument, a professional level instrument, and I really managed to lock in with the music and have a really great feeling solo. It's probably because of, as I mentioned, the quality of the instrument and the way it made you feel that evokes such a great performance. So since 1982, the 57 and 62 reissue Stratocasters, they pretty much remain in the Fender offerings right up till 1998. If you take a look at the 1990 Fender Frontline magazine, you can see it labeled as Fender US Vintage. Then in 1998, they rebranded it as the Fender American Vintage Series. And then by this time, they had named those pickups in those guitars as the Fender Original 5762s. So these Fender American Vintage Series guitars were some of the most accurate reproductions of the guitars from the 1950s and 60s below the custom shop level, but it's still a work in progress. It was still a process of refinement. And they had some of the longest shelf lives in the Fender USA range. So the Fender American Vintage Series introduced in 2006 the 70 Stratocasters, which was from the CBS era with the big headstock, the bullet truss rod, and the 3-bolt neck with the micro tilt adjustment. The 57 and the 62 reissue Strats were retired in 2012, and in its place, Fender introduced the 56 Stratocaster, the 59 Stratocaster, as well as the 65 Stratocasters. And this was packaged under the pure vintage range of the American Vintage Series. Eventually, 6 years later in 2018, Fender rebranded the American Vintage Series to become the Fender Original Series. So what they did was they incorporated some of the more popular, I guess, specifications that customers wanted. For instance, a flatter radius. Before that, the Fender American Vintage Series had a rounder radius, which is more vintage accurate, which is 7.5 inches. The Fender American Originals had 9.5-inch radius, as well as vintage tall 6105 frets. They still spotted the pure vintage pickups, which were awesome. And recently, in October 2022, Fender reintroduced the Fender American Vintage 2 series, which is where we are at today. So it almost feels like somebody at Fender wanted to roll back the time and bring back the Fender American Vintage Series based on the research done to get the 57 and 62 specs reissue Strats. And I think the process that they actually had to go through in order to come up with these instruments, bearing in mind that this was a concerted effort by Fender to reproduce the guitars that they did produce in the original history of Fender. So I think this was too important, in my opinion, of an instrument to do away with. So the general specs of a vintage Stratocaster, as I mentioned, had a 7.5 radius neck, vintage size frets, small size frets. It also had a narrower nut from it's the nut width would be 1 5/8. A modern nut width would be 1 11/16 inch. They would have their 6-screw vintage tremolo and obviously vintage tuners. Some of the contours were sort of more, I guess, smaller details to most customers, right? But I think if the effort went into make Fenders as accurate as possible, say for instance, they were saying the back contours of a 57 was really steep compared to that of a 62. Again, as a consumer, if this stuff is important to you to really get something that feels like the original, then it is good to actually invest in one of these instruments. Someone like me, I came to play guitar in the 90s where this was already post-Fender American standard. So my first experience with Fender, a Modern Stratocaster, was from the American standards. And I got more used to the 9.5-inch radius fretboard and the wider nut and the medium jumbo frets. These were the standard specifications of a Modern Stratocaster, and as well as the 2-post vintage 2-point pivot tremolo, no longer the 6-screw vintage tremolo. Other, I suppose, specifications that define a Modern Stratocaster may include, for instance, your neck chamfered heel, your contoured heel, Also the micro tilt. Okay, this is something that's very interesting. These innovations, let's use the word innovations. There were 4 that I discovered in my research. Okay, let's go through them. Okay, so the first of the 4, in my opinion, brilliant innovations by Fender were the TBX tone control, which is on the Eric Clapton Strat today still, where there was a middle notch. If you pushed it above, you can actually boost the treble, and if you put it below, you could actually try and cut the bass. So the TBX tone control that was actually introduced in the early 80s, in the tail end of the CBS era. They also had the MDX boost, which was eventually adopted by the Fender Eric Clapton signature model and renamed as the mid boost. Okay, it was called the MDX and pretty much does the same thing. Both of these first appeared in the Fender Elite Stratocaster in 1983. When Fender introduced the American Standard, they brought in the TBX tone control as a standard specification on that guitar. 2 other innovations introduced by Fender was the Biflex truss rod, where they already changed in the 70s, the access to the truss rod with the bullet truss rod in the 70s Strats over here. But the Biflex truss rod allowed you to actually have 2 angles, your concave as well as your convex angle of your truss rod if you ever needed it. So it went in both directions. Also, they introduced the micro tilt adjustments at the heel neck joint. This was first introduced in the 70s Strats, where they had the 3-bolt, and it allowed you to introduce a slight angle onto the neck should you need it without using shims and stuff like that. When I changed the string gauge from this guitar to gauge 11s, I had to do that, and I noticed that it required an even finer adjustment than even your truss rod adjustments. I started off with, say, a 1/4 turn on the micro tilt, and it was already too much. I had to back it off to about an 1/8 turn, possibly even less, because my strings were already touching the fretboard. So when I brought it down, and then it gave a nice action throughout. So these 4 innovations came at the tail end of the CBS era, and I believe that these innovations should continue to be used in Fender guitars. Strangely though, some of these have been taken out, like in the Fender American Ultras. They don't have the micro tilt adjustment anymore. Even in the custom shop models, I suppose if you want to order it, you probably can, and you probably have to pay an upcharge for it, or even get a master built equivalent. But it's something that I think should remain in every Fender Stratocaster. And as mentioned, as a modern guy, I prefer the 2-pivot modern tremolo. They still offer this today as a custom classic tremolo. The first time I saw this was on the Fender American Standards. So there you go. These are the specs of the modern as well as the vintage Stratocasters. So what we can take away from this is, in general, a 50 Stratocaster come with maple fretboards. The early 50 Stratocasters had ash bodies. Now the thing about ash is that everybody says it has a mid-scoop sound. I don't know so much about that. This guitar is made of ash, as you can clearly see with the grain, but I find that this has a lot of bass and treble. So perhaps when you boost your bass and treble and not do much with your mid-range, it creates the perception that it is a mid-cut sound rather. That being said, ash generally varies from one piece to the next, whereas alder tends to be more consistent between one piece to the next. Okay, in any case, the early 50 Stratocasters were made of ash. This was changed to alder by 1957. The 1960 Strats generally have rosewood fingerboards, although the transition year was supposed to be in 1959. The early 60s, 60, 61, 62s had what we call a slab rosewood. That means the bottom of the rosewood, plank that they used for the fretboard was flat. 1963 onwards, they actually use a round laminate, a round lam rosewood board. That means the curvature of the neck was rounder, and then they put a rosewood laminate on top. So I suppose if you were to scallop necks from 63 Strats onwards, you'd eventually hit the maple, whereas this won't happen with the early 60 Strats. We all know in 1965 Fender sold to CBS, and some say the quality changed after that. But what happened was the headstock became larger. Why exactly that is, I don't know. But I do like a larger headstock because there's more mass there, and the headstock is the loudest part of the instrument when it's strummed acoustically, so there has to be some benefits there. Some people prefer the older headstock, some people prefer the bigger headstock. It's fine, it's up to you. The 70s Stratocasters changed the neck bolt from 4 bolts to 3 bolts with the added micro tilt adjustment. Some people like that, some people don't. Also, they changed the truss rod access from the neck butt to the headstock, and they added the bullet truss rod access tool. I don't know what exactly that is, but it just looks so cool, especially on the Malmsteen's signature Stratocaster. That's it for this week's lesson, guys. I hope you liked this video, and if you found it informative, please click the like button and consider subscribing to the channel. This has been Hefni for the Hefni Guitar channel, and I will see you in the next one.